The stagecoach lurched to a stop outside the Shoshone City telegraph office, and Victoria Brennan stepped down into the Idaho dust with her leather satchel clutched tight against her ribs, wondering if this remote mining town would be the place where her inability to refuse anyone would finally destroy her completely. She had traveled 3,000 miles from Boston, accepting a position as translator for the Territorial Mining Consortium, because when Mr. Pemberton had written asking if she could manage such a journey, she had said yes, despite her terror of the frontier. When her mother had begged her to stay, she had said yes to leaving anyway because she could not bear to disappoint the man who had offered her employment. When the stagecoach driver had suggested she might want to ride up top in the sun rather than inside the cramped cabin, she had said yes and arrived sunburned and miserable. 24 years of existence, fluency in 7 languages, and still she had never mastered the simple 2-letter word that might have saved her from 1,000 small miseries. The summer of 1882 had turned Shoshone City into a furnace. Victoria adjusted her traveling hat and squinted down the main street, taking in the false-fronted buildings, the miners trudging between the saloons and supply stores, the distant mountains that promised cooler air but delivered only more heat as it radiated off the rocks. She had expected wilderness, perhaps, or danger from outlaws, but she had not expected this crushing sense of displacement, of being a creature designed for libraries and parlors suddenly thrust into a landscape that cared nothing for propriety or education. Miss Brennan. A man emerged from the telegraph office, his suit dusty but his manner crisp. "I am Robert Pemberton. Welcome to Shoshone City. I trust your journey was not too arduous." Victoria opened her mouth to say that it had been perfectly dreadful, that she had been ill twice and propositioned once, and had not slept properly in days. Instead, she heard herself say, "It was quite manageable, thank you. I am pleased to have arrived safely." Pemberton smiled, seemingly satisfied. "Excellent. I have arranged lodgings for you at Mrs. Carson's boarding house. Tomorrow we shall begin work in earnest. There are contracts in Spanish, French, and German that require immediate attention, and several Chinese laborers who need their grievances properly translated. I hope you are not too fatigued to begin promptly." "Not at all," Victoria lied, feeling exhaustion settle into her bones like sediment. "Wonderful. There is one other matter." Pemberton gestured down the street. "We have had some trouble with a local rancher named Xavier Dalton. He has been interfering with our mining operations, claiming we are polluting the creek that runs through his property. I need you to translate some legal documents that will make our position clear to the territorial judge. Can you manage legal terminology?" "Of course," Victoria said, though legal documents made her head ache. Pemberton nodded and turned to summon a boy to carry her trunk. Victoria stood alone for a moment, the sun beating down on her shoulders, and thought that perhaps this was how she would spend the rest of her life, agreeing to things, until she simply disappeared into the weight of all those accumulated yeses. Mrs. Carson's boarding house stood at the edge of town, a whitewashed structure that had probably been cheerful before the desert sun had bleached it into something ghostly. The landlady herself was a widow of perhaps 50, stern-faced but efficient, who showed Victoria to a small room with a window overlooking a struggling vegetable garden. "Meals are at 7, noon, and 6, Mrs. Carson announced. "No gentlemen callers, no drinking, no singing after 9 o'clock. There are 3 other boarders, all respectable men who work for the mining company. Do you have any questions?" Victoria had dozens of questions, primarily about what she had gotten herself into, but she shook her head and smiled. "No, thank you. Everything is perfectly clear." Mrs. Carson departed, and Victoria sat on the narrow bed, feeling tears prick at her eyes. She had come west because she could not say no to opportunity, but also because she could not say no to her father's debts, which had consumed what little family money remained after his death. Her mother had remarried quickly, to a man who made it clear that Victoria's continued presence in his home was unwelcome. The position in Idaho had seemed like salvation, or at least escape. Now it simply felt like exile. She unpacked her few belongings, hanging her 2 good dresses in the cramped wardrobe, arranging her dictionaries on the small table that served as a desk. Among her books was a journal her mother had given her at the train station, with the suggestion that Victoria might record her adventures. Victoria opened it now and wrote a single sentence. "I have arrived in Shoshone City, and I already wish to leave." Then she closed the journal and hid it at the bottom of her trunk, ashamed of her own weakness. The next morning, Pemberton put her to work in a stifling office above the general store. The documents were exactly as tedious as she had feared, full of mineral rights and water claims and easements. Her eyes ached from the small print, and her head throbbed from translating technical terms between languages. By noon, she had finished the Spanish contract and started on the German one, and when Pemberton asked if she could work through lunch to finish it, she said yes, even though she was dizzy with hunger. It was nearly 3 o'clock when she finally set down her pen, the German contract complete. Pemberton was out, so she allowed herself the small rebellion of leaving the office to find food. The heat outside was staggering, the air so dry it seemed to pull moisture directly from her lungs. She made her way to a small restaurant that advertised meals for 50 cents and ordered beef stew, because the proprietor was watching her expectantly, and she could not think quickly enough to consider whether she even wanted beef stew. The food was heavy and salty, but she ate it anyway, sitting at a corner table and watching the street through the window. Miners passed in groups, their faces dark with dust. A wagon loaded with timber creaked past. A Chinese man in traditional clothing hurried by, his eyes downcast, and Victoria wondered if he was one of the laborers she would soon be translating for. The thought made her anxious. What if she said yes to something that hurt them? What if her inability to refuse put someone in danger? She was still worrying at this thought when the restaurant door opened and a man stepped inside, bringing with him the smell of horses and leather and sun-baked earth. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell past his collar and eyes the color of creek water in shadow. His clothes were dusty but well-made, a working man's outfit that had seen care and mending. He moved with a kind of easy confidence that Victoria recognized as the mark of someone who belonged exactly where he was, who had never questioned his right to occupy space in the world. He ordered coffee at the counter, and while he waited, his gaze swept the room and landed on Victoria. For a moment, their eyes met, and Victoria felt something shift in her chest, a recognition without context. Then the proprietor called his attention back to collect his coffee, and the moment broke. The man sat at a table near the door, his back to the wall in the manner of someone accustomed to watching for threats. He drank his coffee black and stared out the window with the expression of a man calculating something complicated. Victoria tried not to watch him, focusing instead on her stew, but her eyes kept drifting back despite her best intentions. When she finished eating, she stood to leave, and as she passed his table, the man looked up. "You are new in town," he said. It was not a question. "I arrived yesterday," Victoria replied, because not answering would have been rude. "Come to work for the mining consortium, I would wager." His tone was neutral, but something in his eyes had gone hard. "I am a translator," Victoria said, defensive without quite knowing why. "A translator." The man took another sip of his coffee. "Then you are the one who will be writing the documents that justify them poisoning my water." Victoria felt her face flush. "I do not know anything about that. I only translate what I am given. And if what you are given is a lie dressed up in legal language—" The man's voice was quiet, but it carried an edge. "Will you translate it anyway?" "I am not in a position to judge the truth of the documents," Victoria said stiffly. "I am employed to provide accurate translation, not to make legal determinations. That is a convenient philosophy for someone who wants to avoid responsibility." The man stood, towering over her. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, the sun-weathered skin, the strength in his hands. He was perhaps 30, give or take a year, and everything about him spoke of competence and purpose. "I am Xavier Dalton. I run a cattle ranch 10 miles north of here. The mining consortium is dumping tailings into Shoshone Creek, which runs through my land and provides water for my herd. The cattle are getting sick, and they want to tell the judge that it is my fault for not maintaining my fences properly. When you translate their lies, remember that you are helping them kill my livelihood." He left before Victoria could formulate a response, the door swinging shut behind him. She stood frozen, her heart hammering, shame and anger warring in her chest. She had been in Shoshone City for less than 2 days, and already she had become complicit in something unjust. And the worst part, the part that made her want to weep, was that she knew she would translate those documents anyway, because when Pemberton asked, she would say yes. She returned to the office and finished the French contract, then started on a series of letters to suppliers in San Francisco. The work was mechanical enough that her mind wandered, replaying the encounter with Xavier Dalton, imagining all the things she should have said. She should have told him she would investigate his claims. She should have promised to speak to Pemberton. She should have at least acknowledged that his concerns were valid. But she had done none of those things, because confrontation required a kind of courage she did not possess. It was easier to be agreeable, to smile and nod and do as she was told. It was the strategy that had kept her safe throughout her childhood, when her father's moods had swung between jovial and explosive. Agreement was armor, compliance was camouflage. And now, she was 24 years old and so thoroughly trained in the art of acquiescence that she could not muster a simple no even when her conscience demanded it. That evening at Mrs. Carson's boarding house, Victoria picked at her dinner and retired early to her room. She lit a candle and opened her journal, intending to write about her encounter with Xavier Dalton, but instead she found herself making a list of all the times in recent memory when she had said yes, when she meant no. The list filled 3 pages. When she was done, she stared at it in the flickering candlelight and felt a wave of despair so profound that she had to set the journal aside and lie down on the bed, fully clothed, staring at the ceiling until exhaustion finally pulled her under. The next morning, Pemberton presented her with the legal documents concerning Xavier Dalton's water rights. As she read through them, Victoria's stomach twisted. The language was designed to obscure rather than clarify, full of clauses that seemed reasonable on the surface, but actually stripped Dalton of any legal recourse. There were references to mining as the highest and best use of natural resources, to the negligible impact of tailings on water quality, to Dalton's failure to maintain adequate filtration systems for his livestock, implying that any sickness in his herd was his own responsibility. "This needs to be translated into lay language for the judge," Pemberton said. "Keep it technical but comprehensible. We want to make our position absolutely clear." Victoria looked down at the documents, then up at Pemberton's expectant face. She thought about Xavier Dalton standing in the restaurant, exhausted and angry and trying to save his livelihood. She thought about her list of yeses, about the weight of all those accumulated capitulations. She opened her mouth and the word was right there, 2 letters, 1 syllable, simple as breathing. But what came out was, "When do you need it completed?" "End of the week," Pemberton said, already turning back to his own work. Victoria bent over the documents, hating herself, hating her weakness, hating the ease with which she had once again betrayed her own conscience. She worked through the morning, finding English equivalents for the Latin legal terms, smoothing the language until it read like simple common sense rather than the calculated destruction of a man's rights. By noon, she had completed a first draft, and she excused herself for lunch feeling nauseous. She did not go to the restaurant this time, afraid she might encounter Xavier Dalton again. Instead, she walked to the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to sagebrush and scattered pines. The mountains rose in the distance, blue-gray against the summer sky. Victoria stood in the shade of a struggling cottonwood and allowed herself the luxury of tears, crying silently for her own inadequacy, for the cruelty of a world that rewarded ruthlessness and punished gentleness, for the gap between the person she wanted to be and the person she actually was. When the tears subsided, she wiped her face and returned to the office. Pemberton was meeting with a group of investors, so she was alone with the documents. She read through her translation again, seeing clearly how it would be used to destroy Xavier Dalton's claim. The judge would read her carefully crafted sentences and rule in favor of the mining consortium, and Dalton would lose his water rights, and his cattle would sicken and die, and eventually he would lose the ranch itself. And she would be complicit in all of it, as surely as if she had poisoned the creek herself. Victoria sat very still, the documents spread before her. Then, with hands that trembled only slightly, she picked up her pen and began to write. Not a translation this time, but a letter. She addressed it to Xavier Dalton, care of the general store, and she wrote quickly before she could lose her nerve. "Mr. Dalton," she wrote, "I am the translator you met yesterday. I want you to know that the documents I have been asked to translate contain language designed to deny your legitimate claim to clean water. The mining consortium is arguing that you have failed to maintain adequate filtration systems, implying that any sickness in your cattle is your own fault. They are also claiming that mining represents the highest use of natural resources and that any environmental impact is negligible. I do not believe these arguments are made in good faith. I thought you should know what you are facing so that you can prepare an adequate defense. I am sorry I did not have the courage to say this to your face. Sincerely, Victoria Brennan." She sealed the letter before she could reconsider, then carried it downstairs to the general store and asked the clerk to ensure it reached Xavier Dalton. The clerk looked at her curiously, but accepted the letter. Victoria returned to the office feeling shaky but also lighter, as if she had set down a burden she had been carrying for years. The rest of the week passed in a blur of work. Victoria translated contracts and letters, mediated a dispute between a French investor and a German supplier, and spent an afternoon with the Chinese laborers, listening to their grievances about wages and working conditions. The laborers were grateful for her attention, and she promised to convey their concerns to Pemberton, though she suspected nothing would come of it. Still, it felt important to bear witness, to acknowledge their humanity even if she could not materially help them. Pemberton praised her work effusively, particularly her translation of the legal documents. "This is excellent," he said, holding up the pages. "Clear and authoritative. The judge will have no grounds to rule against us." Victoria smiled and thanked him and said nothing about the letter. On Friday evening, as Victoria was preparing to leave the office, a boy appeared with a note. It was addressed to her in rough handwriting, and when she opened it, she found a brief message. "Thank you for the warning. I would like to speak with you. Can you meet me tomorrow afternoon at the Shoshone Creek Bridge, 2 miles north of town? I will wait from noon until 2. Xavier Dalton." Victoria's first instinct was to refuse. Meeting a strange man alone outside of town was precisely the sort of risk her mother had warned her about. But her mother had also taught her to be agreeable, to put others' needs before her own, to never cause trouble. The contradictions were dizzying. In the end, curiosity and guilt won out over caution. She wrote a brief reply agreeing to the meeting, and gave it to the boy with a nickel for his trouble. Then she returned to the boarding house and spent the evening in a state of nervous anticipation, alternately imagining the meeting going well and imagining a dozen different disasters. Saturday dawned clear and hot. Victoria dressed in her simplest outfit, a blue cotton dress that would not show dust, and borrowed a sunbonnet from Mrs. Carson. She told the landlady she was going for a walk to explore the countryside, which was true enough, and set off up the road that led north out of town. The landscape was harsh but beautiful in its own way, all sage and stone and wide open sky. Victoria walked steadily, grateful for the bonnet's shade, watching the ground for snakes and trying to remember everything her guidebook had said about surviving the frontier. After about 45 minutes, she saw the bridge ahead, a simple wooden structure spanning a creek that was much smaller than she had expected. The water was low from the summer heat, exposing rocks and sandbars. Xavier Dalton was waiting on the far side of the bridge, sitting on a flat stone with his horse grazing nearby. He stood when he saw her approaching, and Victoria felt her pulse quicken. In the bright sunlight, he looked less intimidating than he had in the dim restaurant, but no less serious. His expression was cautious, assessing. "Miss Brennan," he said as she reached the bridge, "I appreciate you coming. I was not sure you would." "I was not sure I should," Victoria admitted, "but I felt I owed you an honest conversation after writing that letter." Xavier gestured to another flat stone near where he had been sitting. "Will you sit? I have water if you need it. It is a hot day for walking." Victoria accepted the water gratefully, and they sat in awkward silence for a moment, the creek murmuring below them. Up close, Xavier had a weathered handsomeness, the kind that came from years of outdoor work and honest living. His hands were calloused, his face sun-lined, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent. He looked like a man who understood the value of things, who weighed his words before speaking. "I need to understand something," Xavier said finally. "Why did you warn me? You work for Pemberton. You could lose your position." Victoria looked down at her hands. "I warned you, because what they are doing is wrong, and I am tired of being complicit in wrongs simply because I lack the courage to object. I speak 7 languages, Mr. Dalton, but I have never learned how to say no. It is my greatest weakness and my constant shame." Xavier was quiet for a long moment. When Victoria finally risked a glance at his face, she found him watching her with an expression that might have been understanding or possibly pity. She was not sure which would be worse. "I am not entirely sure what to do with that confession," Xavier said slowly. "But I think I understand something of what you mean. I have known people who could not refuse a request, who gave and gave until there was nothing left of them. My mother was like that. She died young from exhaustion, from trying to be everything to everyone." "I am sorry," Victoria said softly. "It was a long time ago." Xavier turned his attention back to the creek. "I brought you out here because I wanted you to see what is at stake. Upstream from here, about a mile, is where the mining consortium dumps its tailings. You can see the discoloration in the water even from here if you know what to look for. That gray tint, that is not natural. That is mercury and arsenic and other things that should not be in a creek that cattle drink from. Victoria followed his gaze and saw what he meant. The water did have a strange quality to it, a dullness that seemed wrong. How many cattle have gotten sick? 20 so far. 5 have died. I had to put down 2 others because they were suffering and there was no saving them. Xavier's voice was controlled, but Victoria could hear the anger beneath it. This ranch has been in my family for 20 years. My father built it from nothing, and when he died, he left it to me and my sister. She married and moved to Oregon, so it is mine to manage now. I have 30 head of cattle, which may not sound like much, but it is enough to make a living if the water stays clean and the grazing holds. Pemberton and his consortium are taking that away from me, and they are doing it legally, with documents and courts and the weight of capital behind them. What will you do? Victoria asked. Fight, I suppose, though your letter made it clear that I am likely to lose. Xavier picked up a pebble and tossed it into the creek. I cannot afford a lawyer, at least not a good one, and even if I could, the law tends to favor money over justice in these situations. But I have to try. This land is all I have, and more than that, it is my responsibility. I cannot just walk away. Victoria felt something crack open in her chest, a sudden fierce admiration for this man who refused to yield even when defeat was probable. He had something she had never possessed, a core of unyielding principle that would not bend even under pressure. She envied it desperately. I wish I could help you more, she said, but I do not know how. Xavier turned to look at her directly, and the intensity of his gaze made her breath catch. You have already helped more than you know. That letter gave me information I needed. And maybe there are other ways you could help if you were willing. What do you mean? The Chinese laborers you mentioned, the ones with grievances. Are those grievances documented anywhere? Because if the mining consortium is mistreating its workers in addition to polluting the water, that might be something a judge would care about. It might establish a pattern of bad faith operation. Victoria considered this. I have notes from my conversation with them, but nothing official. Pemberton has not asked me to prepare a formal report. But you could prepare one anyway, could you not? On your own time as a private citizen rather than an employee. Xavier leaned forward. I am not asking you to do anything dishonest, just to document what you have already witnessed. The truth in your own words. And then what? Give it to you to present to the judge. Exactly. Victoria felt the familiar weight of a request, the pull to agree simply because someone had asked. But this time it was different. This time, saying yes meant siding with justice rather than expediency. This time it meant doing something difficult but right. I will do it, she said. I will write a report on what the laborers told me, and I will give it to you to use however you see fit. Xavier's face broke into a smile, and Victoria realized it was the first time she had seen him smile. It transformed his features, softening the hard lines, lighting up his eyes. He was, she thought with some surprise, genuinely handsome when he was happy. Thank you, he said, truly. You are taking a risk for someone you barely know. Perhaps I am tired of playing it safe, Victoria said. The words surprised her even as she spoke them, but she realized they were true. She had spent her entire life trying to avoid conflict, trying to make herself small and agreeable, and what had it gained her? A position translating documents for people she did not respect, in a town where she knew no one, in a landscape that terrified her. Maybe it was time to try being brave instead of being nice. They talked for a while longer, Xavier describing his ranch and the rhythms of cattle work, Victoria sharing carefully edited stories of her life in Boston. The conversation flowed more easily than Victoria would have expected, and she found herself laughing at Xavier's dry observations about life in Idaho Territory. He had a subtle humor, a way of describing absurdities with perfect deadpan delivery that caught her off guard. When the sun reached its zenith, Xavier said he needed to get back to the ranch. "I have already been away longer than I should," he explained. "I have a hired hand, but he is young and still learning. I do not like to leave him alone too long." They walked back to the bridge together, and Xavier helped Victoria onto the road that led back to town. As she was turning to leave, he caught her hand. The touch was brief but warm, his calloused palm against her gloved fingers. "Will you meet me again?" he asked. "I would like to know how your report is progressing, and I would like to see you again regardless." Victoria felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I would like that too," she admitted. "Next Saturday, same time and place." "Yes," Victoria said, and this time the word felt like freedom rather than surrender. She walked back to town in a daze, barely noticing the heat or the dust. Her mind was full of Xavier, of his serious eyes and rare smile, of the way he had listened to her as if her words mattered. She had known him for less than a week and spoken to him only twice, but already she felt drawn to him in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. This was not the safe, sensible future her mother had wanted for her, marriage to some respectable businessman who would keep her in comfort and boredom. This was something wild and uncertain, as untamed as the Idaho mountains. That night, Victoria sat at her small desk and began writing the report. She documented everything the Chinese laborers had told her, their wages that were a fraction of what white workers earned for the same labor, the dangerous conditions in the mines, the lack of medical care when someone was injured. She wrote carefully and precisely, sticking to facts, letting the injustices speak for themselves. When she was done, she had 5 pages of densely written testimony. The next week crept by slowly. Victoria continued her work for Pemberton, translating documents and facilitating communications, but her heart was not in it. She kept thinking about Xavier, about their meeting by the creek, about the way his face had looked when he smiled. She felt like a different person than she had been 2 weeks ago, as if coming to Idaho had shaken something loose inside her. On Wednesday, Pemberton called her into his office. "I have heard a disturbing rumor," he said without preamble. "Someone claims to have seen you meeting with Xavier Dalton last Saturday. Is this true?" Victoria's heart hammered, but she kept her voice steady. "I went for a walk and happened to encounter him near the creek. We spoke briefly." "About what?" "About the water dispute." He explained his perspective on the matter. Pemberton's face darkened. "Miss Brennan, I must remind you that you are employed by this consortium. Fraternizing with someone who is actively working against our interests is, at best, deeply inappropriate. At worst, it could be considered a betrayal of trust." Victoria felt anger flare in her chest, hot and unfamiliar. "I was on my own time, Mr. Pemberton. I am entitled to speak with whomever I choose on my own time." "Not when it creates a conflict of interest," Pemberton snapped. "I am going to be direct with you, Miss Brennan. You are a talented translator, but you are also young and inexperienced. I took a chance hiring you, and I expect loyalty in return. If I hear that you have been meeting with Dalton again, I will have no choice but to terminate your employment. Do I make myself clear?" For a long moment, Victoria stared at him, feeling 24 years of accumulated compliance warring with her newfound desire for autonomy. Then, to her own amazement, she heard herself say, "Perfectly clear, Mr. Pemberton. And I want to make something clear to you in return. I will do the work you pay me to do, and I will do it well. But my personal time is my own, and you have no authority over it. If that is unacceptable to you, then perhaps we should part ways now." Pemberton looked genuinely shocked. "Are you threatening to quit?" "I am establishing boundaries," Victoria said, marveling at her own boldness. "I believe that is what adults do in professional relationships." There was a tense silence. Then Pemberton waved his hand dismissively. "Fine. Keep your personal life separate from your work, and we will have no problems. But I am warning you, Miss Brennan, Xavier Dalton is not a man you want to involve yourself with. He is stubborn and unreasonable, and he is going to lose his ranch whether you help him or not. Do not throw away your career for a lost cause." Victoria left the office feeling shaky but triumphant. She had not said no exactly, but she had refused to be cowed, which felt like a close cousin to refusing. It was a small victory, but it mattered. Saturday arrived at last. Victoria told Mrs. Carson she was going for another walk, and this time the landlady gave her a knowing look, but said nothing. Victoria walked north again, following the now familiar road to the creek, and found Xavier waiting for her at the bridge as promised. This time he had brought a blanket and a basket of food. "I thought you might be hungry after your walk," he explained. "And I wanted to make this a proper visit, not just a furtive meeting." They sat on the blanket in the shade of a cottonwood, and Xavier unpacked bread and cheese and apples, along with a jar of water from a clean spring on his property. The food was simple but good, and Victoria realized she was ravenous. They ate in companionable silence for a while, watching the creek flow past. "I finished the report," Victoria said eventually. "It documents everything the Chinese laborers told me about their working conditions. I think it makes a strong case for the consortium operating in bad faith." Xavier's face lit up. "May I see it?" Victoria pulled the folded pages from her pocket and handed them over. Xavier read slowly, his expression growing darker as he progressed through the document. When he finished, he looked up at Victoria with something like awe. "This is damning," he said. "This could actually make a difference." "I hope so," Victoria said. "Though I should warn you, Pemberton knows I met with you last week. Someone saw us. He threatened to fire me if I see you again." Xavier's jaw tightened. "And yet you came anyway." I told him my personal time was my own. Victoria felt a flush of pride at the memory. It was the first time I have ever stood up to an employer. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Xavier reached over and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. The gesture was intimate and presumptuous and wonderful. "You are braver than you think," he said quietly. "It takes courage to change the patterns of a lifetime." They sat holding hands for a long moment, and Victoria felt something shift inside her, some fundamental reordering of priorities. For the first time in her life, she was choosing something she wanted rather than something someone else wanted for her. She was choosing this man, this uncertain future, this risk. "I should tell you something," Xavier said, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "I have been thinking about you constantly since our first meeting. I know we barely know each other, and I know the timing is terrible with the legal battle and everything else. But I wanted you to know that this is not just about the report or the case. I am drawn to you in a way I have not experienced before." Victoria's heart was hammering so hard she was sure Xavier could hear it. "I feel the same way," she admitted. "It makes no logical sense. We have known each other less than 2 weeks. But I find myself counting the days until I can see you again." Xavier smiled that rare, transformative smile. "Then we are in agreement, at least on this." They spent the rest of the afternoon talking, sharing stories from their pasts, learning each other's histories. Xavier told her about growing up on the ranch, about his father's death from pneumonia 3 winters ago, about his sister's wedding and departure. Victoria told him about her father's gambling debts, about her mother's rushed remarriage, about the loneliness of being educated beyond her social position. Too learned for easy friendship, but too poor for respectability. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, Xavier said, "I need to present this report and the information from your letter to the judge next week. The hearing is set for Thursday. Will you come? I know it might be difficult with Pemberton, but I would like to have you there." Victoria thought about Pemberton's threat, about the risk to her employment. Then she thought about Xavier's face when he talked about his dying cattle, about the Chinese laborers earning a pittance in dangerous conditions, about all the times she had chosen safety over integrity. "I will be there," she said. "I will ask Pemberton for the time as personal leave, and if he refuses, I will go anyway." Xavier lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a courtly gesture that made Victoria's breath catch. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." Walking back to town that evening, Victoria felt as though she was glowing from the inside out. She had never been courted before, had never experienced the giddy anticipation of nascent romance. It was wonderful and dizzying and slightly alarming. She was falling in love with a man she barely knew, staking her future on a connection that might be nothing more than proximity and timing. But it did not feel like nothing. It felt like everything. The next few days were tense. Victoria went through the motions of her work, translating documents and mediating disputes, but her mind was elsewhere. On Tuesday, she requested Thursday off for personal business, and Pemberton's face darkened with suspicion. "This is about Dalton's hearing, is it not?" he demanded. Victoria met his gaze steadily. "It is personal business, as I said. If you attend that hearing, Miss Brennan, I will consider it a termination of your employment. Is that clear?" "Perfectly clear," Victoria said and walked out of the office. That night, she sat in her room at the boarding house and took stock of her situation. If she attended the hearing, she would lose her job. If she lost her job, she would have no income and no way to pay for her room and board. She would probably have to return to Boston, to her mother's house and her stepfather's cold disapproval. It was the sensible thing, the safe thing, to skip the hearing and keep her position. But Victoria was tired of being sensible and safe. She was tired of choosing security over integrity, tired of saying yes when she meant no, tired of living a life defined by fear rather than conviction. Whatever happened, she would attend the hearing. She would stand beside Xavier and bear witness to the truth, and she would accept the consequences. Thursday morning arrived gray and overcast, unusual weather for August in Idaho. Victoria dressed carefully in her best outfit, a dark green dress with black trim that made her look older and more serious. She pinned her hair into a severe bun and regarded herself in the mirror. The face looking back at her was determined, almost unrecognizable. This was not the agreeable young woman who had stepped off the stagecoach 3 weeks ago. This was someone harder, braver, more certain. The hearing was held in the territorial courthouse, an imposing stone building that was the largest structure in Shoshone City. Victoria slipped into the courtroom and found a seat near the back, hoping to avoid Pemberton's notice. Xavier was at the front with a lawyer he must have managed to scrape together funds to hire, a nervous-looking young man who kept shuffling papers. Pemberton was there too, along with 2 other consortium officials and a silver-haired attorney who radiated expensive competence. The judge was a tired-looking man in his 50s who seemed impatient to get through the proceedings. He called the court to order and asked Xavier's lawyer to present the case. The young lawyer stood and began reading from a prepared statement, laying out Xavier's claim that the mining consortium was polluting Shoshone Creek in violation of his water rights. The consortium's attorney responded with a lengthy rebuttal, citing the documents Victoria had translated, arguing that mining represented the highest use of resources and that any environmental impact was negligible. He presented expert testimony from a mining engineer who claimed the tailings were harmless. He suggested that Xavier's cattle had been sickened by poor management rather than water quality. Victoria watched Xavier's face tighten with anger and frustration. The proceedings were clearly not going in his favor. The judge seemed to be nodding along with the consortium's arguments, his expression suggesting he had already made up his mind. Then Xavier's lawyer stood again and said, "Your Honor, we have additional evidence that speaks to the consortium's pattern of operation. We have a report, prepared by a professional translator employed by the consortium itself, documenting serious mistreatment of Chinese laborers. We believe this establishes that the consortium is willing to cut corners and disregard human welfare in pursuit of profit." The consortium's attorney immediately objected, but the judge allowed the report to be entered into evidence. Xavier's lawyer read selected passages aloud. Victoria's careful documentation of wage theft and dangerous conditions. The courtroom grew quiet as the testimony unfolded. When the lawyer finished, the judge frowned and turned to the consortium's attorney. "Do you have a response to these allegations?" The silver-haired attorney looked thrown for the first time. "Your Honor, that report was prepared by a rogue employee who has no authority to speak for the consortium. We categorically deny all allegations of worker mistreatment." "But you do not deny that the report was prepared by your own translator," the judge pressed. "That is correct, but as I said, she was acting outside the scope of her employment." The judge turned to look at the courtroom. "Is Victoria Brennan present?" Victoria's heart sank. She stood slowly, feeling every eye in the room turn toward her. "I am here, Your Honor." "Did you prepare this report, Miss Brennan?" "I did, Your Honor. I interviewed the Chinese laborers and documented their statements accurately to the best of my ability." "And why did you prepare this report if it was outside the scope of your employment?" Victoria took a breath, steadying herself. "Because the laborers asked for my help, and I could not refuse them. Because I have spent my entire life saying yes when I meant no, and I am trying to learn how to do better. Because sometimes standing up for what is right is more important than job security." There was a murmur in the courtroom. The judge regarded her thoughtfully. "That is a principled position, Miss Brennan. Thank you for your honesty." Pemberton was on his feet now, his face red with fury. "Your Honor, I move to have Miss Brennan's testimony stricken. She is clearly biased and has violated her employment contract." "Your employment disputes are not this court's concern, Mr. Pemberton," the judge said dryly. "Please sit down." The hearing continued for another hour with arguments and counter-arguments flying back and forth, but Victoria could sense that the momentum had shifted. The judge kept returning to her report, asking pointed questions about the consortium's labor practices. When the consortium's attorney tried to deflect, the judge cut him off. Finally, the judge called for a brief recess to review the evidence. Victoria remained in her seat, her hands trembling slightly. Xavier turned around and found her in the crowd, and the look he gave her was full of gratitude and something deeper, something that made her chest ache with feeling. When the judge returned, his expression was grave. "I have reviewed all the evidence presented today," he said. "While I am primarily concerned with the water rights issue, I cannot ignore the broader pattern of behavior documented in Miss Brennan's report. It is clear to me that the mining consortium has been operating with a disregard for both environmental and human welfare. Therefore, I am ruling in favor of Mr. Dalton. The consortium is hereby ordered to cease dumping tailings into Shoshone Creek, and to implement proper waste management procedures. Additionally, I am referring the labor practices detailed in Miss Brennan's report to the Territorial Labor Board for investigation. This hearing is adjourned. The courtroom erupted. Pemberton was shouting something about appeals. The consortium's attorney was gathering his papers with angry, jerky movements. But Xavier was striding toward Victoria, and when he reached her, he swept her into an embrace that lifted her off her feet. "You did it," he said into her hair. "You actually did it." "We did it," Victoria corrected, but she was laughing, giddy with relief and triumph and the sheer impossibility of what had just happened. Outside the courthouse, away from Pemberton's furious glare, Xavier took both of Victoria's hands in his. "I know everything is uncertain right now," he said. "I know you just lost your position and that puts you in a difficult situation, but I want to offer you something if you will consider it. Come stay at the ranch. I have a spare room that was my sister's. You can stay as long as you need while you figure out your next steps. I promise you will be safe and respected, and if you decide you want to return to Boston or go somewhere else entirely, I will help you however I can." Victoria looked into his earnest, hopeful face and felt her heart make a decision her mind had not quite caught up with yet. "I cannot take your charity," she said slowly, "but if you are offering employment, I could accept that. I could keep your books, help with correspondence, translate if needed. I could earn my keep." "I am offering anything you are willing to accept," Xavier said. "Employment, friendship, shelter, whatever you need." "Then I accept," Victoria said, "all of it." They collected Victoria's belongings from Mrs. Carson's boarding house, where the landlady clucked sympathetically and refused to charge her for the remaining days of the month. Then Xavier helped Victoria into his wagon, and they drove north out of Shoshone City, leaving behind the heat and dust and the wreckage of her brief employment. The ranch was smaller than Victoria had imagined, but it was well maintained and somehow welcoming. The house was a simple wooden structure with a wide porch, and inside it was spare but clean. Xavier showed her to the spare room, which had a real bed with a quilt and a window that looked out over the pastures. "My sister made that quilt," he said. "She would want you to use it." That night, they ate a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, and Xavier told her more about the ranch, about his plans to expand the herd once the water situation was resolved, about his hope to eventually build a better barn. Victoria listened and asked questions, and felt a contentment she had not known she was capable of feeling. As the days passed into weeks, Victoria settled into a rhythm at the ranch. She helped Xavier with the bookkeeping, which had been neglected since his sister's departure. She wrote letters to potential buyers for his cattle. She even learned to help with some of the easier ranch tasks, feeding chickens and gathering eggs and mending fences. The work was hard and sometimes tedious, but it was also deeply satisfying in a way her translation work had never been. She was building something rather than just facilitating other people's business, and through it all, her feelings for Xavier deepened and complicated. They were living in the same house, working side by side, sharing meals and conversation and the countless small intimacies of daily life. Xavier was unfailingly respectful, never presuming on their situation, always treating her as a valued colleague rather than a romantic prospect. But Victoria could see the way he looked at her when he thought she was not paying attention, could feel the charge in the air when their hands accidentally touched. One evening in late September, they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, and Xavier said quietly, "I need to tell you something." Victoria's heart clenched. "What is it?" "I am falling in love with you," Xavier said, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Actually, that is not accurate. I have already fallen. I am in love with you, Victoria. I have been since that first day at the bridge when you told me about your inability to say no, and I saw the courage it took for you to admit that. I know the timing is complicated, and I know I am just a rancher with 30 head of cattle and a mortgaged property. But I needed you to know how I feel. I cannot keep pretending this is just friendship. Victoria felt tears prick her eyes, but they were happy tears. I am in love with you too, she said. I think I have been since you said I was braver than I thought. No one has ever seen me that way before. No one has ever made me want to be brave. Xavier turned to her then, and the look in his eyes made her breath stop. I want to court you properly, he said. I want to do this right. But I also want to kiss you desperately, and I have wanted that for weeks, and I am not sure I can be patient much longer. Then do not be patient, Victoria whispered. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to change her mind, and when their lips finally met, it felt like coming home. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, and then it deepened into something more urgent. Victoria's hands found their way into Xavier's hair, and his arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. I want to marry you, he said. I know it is too soon, and I know you probably think I am insane. But I am 31 years old, and I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. I do not want to waste time being cautious. I want to build a life with you. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to expand this ranch together and raise children together and grow old together. Will you marry me, Victoria Brennan? Victoria pulled back enough to look into his eyes. She thought about all the times she had said yes when she meant no, all the years of compliance and accommodation. And then she thought about this man who had seen her weakness and called it courage, who had given her shelter and purpose and love. This yes was different. This yes was a choice, freely made with full knowledge of what she was agreeing to. Yes, she said, and kissed him again. Yes, I will marry you. I want all of that too, all of it. They were married in November in a simple ceremony at the small church in Shoshone City. Mrs. Carson came, along with Xavier's hired hand and a handful of ranch families from the surrounding area. The Chinese laborers she had helped sent a collective gift, a beautiful embroidered tapestry that Victoria hung in the parlor. Even the young lawyer who had represented Xavier at the hearing attended, grinning broadly throughout the service. Pemberton did not come, of course. The mining consortium had appealed the judge's ruling, but the Territorial Labor Board had launched a full investigation into their practices, and several officials were facing criminal charges. The consortium itself was struggling financially, many investors having pulled out once the extent of their misconduct became public. Victoria felt no satisfaction in their downfall, only relief that the workers might finally receive justice. The winter of 1882 was mild by Idaho standards, and Victoria learned to navigate life as a rancher's wife. She kept the books and managed the household and learned to ride a horse, though she never quite lost her city person's wariness of the large animals. Xavier was patient with her learning curve, and his hired hand, a boy named Tommy who was barely 19, was endlessly amused by her questions about ranch life. In February, Victoria realized she was pregnant. She told Xavier on a cold morning while they were feeding the cattle, and he picked her up and spun her around, laughing with joy. "We are going to be parents," he kept saying. "We are going to have a family." Their son was born in early October of 1883, a squalling red-faced infant they named Samuel, after Xavier's father. Victoria had been terrified of childbirth, had spent the pregnancy reading every medical text she could find and worrying about all the things that could go wrong. But when she finally held Samuel in her arms, all the fear evaporated, replaced by a fierce protective love unlike anything she had ever experienced. Xavier proved to be a devoted father, walking the floor with Samuel during the night feedings, changing diapers without complaint, singing lullabies in a surprisingly good baritone. Watching him with their son, Victoria felt her love deepen into something almost painful in its intensity. This was the life she had been afraid to hope for, the happiness she had not known she was allowed to claim. As Samuel grew from infant to toddler, the ranch prospered. The cattle herd expanded to 50 head, then 75. Xavier hired another hand to help with the increased workload. Victoria started offering translation services to other ranchers and businesses in the area, working from home and building a modest but steady income. The money allowed them to make improvements to the property, adding a proper barn and expanding the house. In the spring of 1885, Victoria gave birth to twin daughters, Emma and Grace. The pregnancy had been difficult, and the birth even more so, but both babies were healthy and Victoria recovered fully. With 3 children under the age of 2, life became chaotic and exhausting and wonderful. Xavier's sister visited from Oregon and stayed for 2 months, helping with the babies and reconnecting with her brother. One evening, after the children were finally asleep, Xavier and Victoria sat on the porch as they had on that first night when they confessed their feelings. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "You ever regret it?" Xavier asked quietly. "Giving up your career as a translator, staying out here in the middle of nowhere?" Victoria considered the question seriously. "I miss speaking different languages sometimes," she admitted. "I miss the intellectual challenge of finding the perfect word or phrase. But regret? No, I have never regretted choosing this life. I have never regretted choosing you." Xavier took her hand, their fingers interlacing with the ease of long practice. "I am grateful every day that you walked into that restaurant, that you had the courage to write that letter, to attend the hearing, to risk everything for what was right. You changed my life, Victoria. You saved my ranch and gave me a family, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you." "You already deserve me," Victoria said. "And I deserve you. We deserve each other. We chose each other and we keep choosing each other every day. That is what marriage is, I think. 1,000 small choices to stay, to love, to build something together." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear, bright and numerous in the clear mountain air. From inside the house came a small cry, one of the twins waking. Victoria started to rise, but Xavier put a hand on her arm. "I will go," he said. "You rest." Victoria watched him disappear into the house and felt a wave of contentment so profound. It was almost like grief, a sharp awareness of how easily this happiness could have been missed if she had made different choices, if she had stayed in Boston or kept working for Pemberton, or never found the courage to say yes when it mattered. But she had found that courage, or perhaps it had found her. She had learned, finally, that saying yes to the right things was just as important as saying no to the wrong ones. She had learned to choose, to act with intention, to build a life based on her own values rather than other people's expectations. It had been the hardest lesson of her life, and the most important. Years passed in a blur of seasons and milestones. Samuel grew into a serious boy who loved books and animals in equal measure. The twins were wild and adventurous, constantly finding new ways to worry their parents. In 1888, Victoria gave birth to another son, Daniel, and the family felt complete. The ranch continued to thrive under Xavier's careful management. He became known throughout the territory as a fair employer and a skilled cattleman. Victoria's translation business grew as well, and she took on increasingly complex projects, including a series of legal documents for the territorial government. The irony was not lost on her that she had returned to the work she had once done for Pemberton, but now on her own terms, for causes she believed in. The mining consortium that had employed her eventually went bankrupt, and Pemberton left Idaho Territory under a cloud of scandal. Victoria felt no schadenfreude at his downfall, only sadness that it had taken so long for justice to catch up with him. The Chinese laborers she had advocated for eventually received back wages and compensation, a small victory in a larger struggle that would continue for generations. In 1890, Idaho became a state, and Xavier was elected to serve on the new state legislature, representing the interests of ranchers and rural communities. He served one term before declining to run again, preferring to focus on his family and his land. Victoria was proud of his service, but secretly relieved when he came home for good. She had missed him during the legislative session, missed their evening conversations on the porch, missed the simple comfort of his presence. Their children grew and thrived. Samuel went east to attend college, studying animal husbandry and planning to return to the ranch. Emma became a teacher, while Grace showed early talent as an artist. Daniel was still young, but he had his father's steady competence and his mother's quick mind. The ranch house rang with laughter and argument, and the chaotic energy of a large family. On their 10th wedding anniversary in November 1893, Xavier took Victoria back to the bridge where they had first really talked. It was late autumn, the cottonwoods bare and the creek running high from early snow melt. They stood where they had sat a decade earlier, and Xavier took both her hands in his. "I want to thank you," he said, "for 10 years of happiness, for 4 beautiful children, for being my partner in every sense of the word. You are the best decision I ever made, Victoria Dalton." Victoria smiled, feeling tears prick her eyes. "You are the best decision I ever made too, or rather, the best yes I ever said. You remember what you told me that first day? That you spoke 7 languages but could not say no. I remember. It was my greatest weakness." Xavier shook his head. "It was never a weakness. You had a generous heart, and the world had taught you that generosity meant never refusing anyone anything. But you learned to channel that generosity toward what mattered. You learned to say yes to justice, yes to love, yes to the life you wanted to build. That was not weakness. That was strength." "Then I will say it for you," Victoria murmured, echoing the words Xavier had spoken to her all those years ago when she was still learning to stand up for herself. "Say what?" Xavier asked, confused. "Thank you," Victoria said, "for seeing me clearly from the very beginning, for offering me a choice when I thought I had none, for loving me enough to wait while I figured out how to love myself. You taught me that saying yes could be an act of courage rather than compliance. You taught me that I was worth choosing. So thank you, Xavier, for everything." They kissed then, standing on the bridge with the cold wind whipping around them, and Victoria felt the same jolt of recognition she had felt the first time their lips met. This was her person, her choice, her life. She had built it word by word, yes by yes, choice by choice, until it became something solid and real and undeniably hers. The years continued to pass, bringing joys and sorrows in equal measure. Victoria's mother died in 1895, and Victoria made the long journey back to Boston for the funeral, bringing the children to meet the grandmother they barely knew. It was a bittersweet trip, full of complicated feelings about the past and gratitude for the present. Victoria's stepfather was noticeably absent from the proceedings, and she did not inquire about him. In 1900, Samuel graduated from college and returned to Idaho to work the ranch alongside his father. The twins were 18 now, Emma teaching at the school in Shoshone City and Grace studying art in San Francisco. Daniel was 12, showing early signs of his father's ranching skills and his mother's linguistic aptitude. The house was quieter with the older children gone, but also more peaceful. Xavier and Victoria rediscovered the simple pleasure of each other's company without the constant demands of young children. They still sat on the porch most evenings, watching the sun set over the mountains, talking about the day's events or simply enjoying the silence. Sometimes Victoria would practice her languages, running through vocabulary in Spanish or French or German, and Xavier would listen with amused indulgence. He had picked up a fair amount of Spanish over the years, enough to communicate with the Mexican ranch hands they sometimes hired for seasonal work, but he had no particular gift for languages. That was Victoria's domain, as cattle management was his. In the spring of 1902, Xavier's sister died unexpectedly in Oregon, and he made the journey west for her funeral. He returned subdued and thoughtful, and for several weeks he was quieter than usual. Finally, one evening on the porch, he said, "Being at her funeral made me think about our own mortality. We are both in our 40s now. The children are mostly grown. We have lived a good life, but there is still so much I want to do with you, places I want to take you, things I want to show you." "What sort of things?" Victoria asked. "I want to take you to San Francisco to visit Grace. I want to show you the California coast. I want to travel with you somewhere we have never been, just the two of us, before we are too old to enjoy it." Victoria smiled. "That sounds wonderful. Let's do it." Samuel can manage the ranch for a few weeks. They made the trip that summer, traveling by train to San Francisco and spending a month exploring the city and the surrounding area. Grace showed them her art studio, introduced them to her bohemian friends, took them to galleries and museums. They visited the ocean, and Victoria saw the Pacific for the first time, standing on a cliff and watching the waves crash against the rocks below. Xavier wrapped his arms around her from behind, and they stood like that for a long time, salt wind in their faces, feeling young and adventurous despite their middle age. On their last night in San Francisco, they had dinner at an elegant restaurant overlooking the bay. As they ate, Victoria said, "I have been thinking about something. You know how I built up my translation business over the years. I have been offered a position as a translator for the new International Trade Office in Boise. It would mean traveling to the state capital once a month, staying for a few days at a time. It would be good money and intellectually challenging, but it would also mean time away from the ranch and from you. I wanted to know how you felt about it before I made a decision." Xavier was quiet for a moment, considering. Then he said, "What do you want to do?" "I am asking what you want," Victoria said. "I know. And I am asking what you want, not what I want or what you think I want or what would be most convenient for everyone else. What do you, Victoria Dalton, want for yourself?" Victoria felt her eyes sting with sudden tears. After 20 years of marriage, he was still teaching her this lesson, still reminding her that her desires mattered. "I want to take the position," she admitted. "I love the ranch and I love our life, but I miss using my languages in a professional capacity. I miss the challenge of complex translation work. I want to do this." "Then you should do it," Xavier said simply. "We will figure out the logistics. Samuel can help more around the ranch, or we can hire additional help. But you should not give up something you want just because it is inconvenient for me. You have earned the right to pursue your own ambitions." Victoria reached across the table and took his hand. "How did I get so lucky?" She whispered. "How did I find a man who encourages me to take up space in the world rather than making myself small?" "It is not luck," Xavier said. "It is choice. You chose to stand up for what was right, even when it cost you. You chose to say yes to the life you wanted. You chose me, and I chose you, and we have spent 20 years choosing each other. That is not luck. That is love. Victoria took the position with the International Trade Office, and for the next several years, she divided her time between the ranch and boys. The work was challenging and fulfilling, exactly what she had hoped for. She translated documents in 7 languages, facilitated communications between foreign businesses and Idaho companies, and occasionally served as an interpreter for visiting dignitaries. It was a far cry from her brief, disastrous employment with the mining consortium, and she relished every moment of it. The children continued to grow and establish their own lives. Samuel married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring property, and they had 2 children in quick succession, making Xavier and Victoria grandparents. Emma married a schoolteacher and settled in Shoshone City. Grace remained in San Francisco, unmarried but happy, building a successful career as an artist. Daniel followed his brother into ranch management, and it became clear that the Dalton Ranch would remain in family hands for another generation. In 1910, Xavier and Victoria celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary. Their children organized a party at the ranch, inviting friends and neighbors from across the territory. It was a joyous celebration, full of music and dancing and toasts to the happy couple. At one point, Samuel stood up and gave a speech about his parents' enduring love, and Victoria had to wipe away tears. Later that night, after all the guests had left and the children had retired to their rooms, Xavier and Victoria walked out to the creek, following the path they had walked countless times over the years. The moon was full, casting silver light across the water. They stood on the bridge, the same bridge where they had met all those years ago, and Victoria thought about how much had changed and how much had stayed the same. 25 years, Xavier said softly. It has gone by so quickly. I feel like we were just starting out and now we are grandparents. We have built a good life, Victoria said. A life I am proud of, and we have built it together as partners. Do you remember what you said to me that first day? Xavier asked. When I told you I would say no for you, Victoria smiled. I remember everything about that day. It was the day my life changed. Mine too. Xavier pulled her close, and they stood wrapped in each other's arms, listening to the creek murmur below them. I love you, Victoria. I have loved you from the beginning, and I will love you to the end. You are my greatest adventure, my truest companion, my heart. And you are mine, Victoria whispered, always and forever. They walked back to the house hand in hand, and Victoria felt a deep sense of peace. She had come to Idaho 28 years ago, a frightened young woman who could not say no, who felt powerless in the face of others' expectations. She had been transformed by this harsh, beautiful landscape, by the challenges it presented and the choices it demanded. But most of all, she had been transformed by love, by Xavier's patient faith in her, by his insistence that she was worthy of taking up space in the world. The years passed more gently now. Xavier's hair turned silver, and Victoria's auburn curls faded to gray. They slowed down, spending more time on the porch and less time riding the range. Samuel took over most of the ranch operations, though Xavier remained involved in major decisions. Victoria continued her translation work, though less frequently as age made travel more difficult. They were content, settled into the comfortable rhythms of long marriage. In the spring of 1918, the world was in turmoil. The Great War raged in Europe, and even distant Idaho felt its effects. Daniel had enlisted and was serving overseas, and Victoria spent her days anxiously reading newspapers and praying for his safety. When the telegram came in November, announcing that he had been wounded but would survive, Victoria wept with relief in Xavier's arms. Daniel returned home in early 1919, thinner and quieter but whole. He slowly readjusted to ranch life, and Victoria watched with a mother's helpless concern as he worked through whatever he had experienced in the war. Xavier was patient with him, giving him space when he needed it and work when he needed distraction. Gradually, Daniel began to heal and the family breathed easier. The 1920s brought prosperity to the ranch. Cattle prices were good and the family business expanded. Samuel's children were growing up on the ranch, learning the same skills their grandfather had taught their father. Emma's children visited regularly from Shoshone City. Grace, still in San Francisco, had become a renowned artist whose work sold for impressive sums. The family that Victoria and Xavier had built together was thriving, spreading out across Idaho and beyond. On their 40th wedding anniversary in 1933, the family gathered again at the ranch for a celebration. Victoria was 75 now, Xavier 71. They moved more slowly, tired more easily, but their love for each other remained as fierce and tender as ever. At the party, their grandchildren performed a skit about how their grandparents had met, complete with Victoria's confession about speaking 7 languages but not being able to say no, and Xavier's promise to say it for her. Victoria laughed until she cried, and Xavier squeezed her hand, his eyes twinkling with the same warmth she had seen in them 40 years earlier. That night, alone in their room, Victoria said, "I have been thinking about everything we have built together. The ranch, the family, the life. And I realized that none of it would have happened if I had not found the courage to write that letter, to warn you about what Pemberton was planning. That one small act of defiance changed everything." "It was not small," Xavier said. "It was the bravest thing you had ever done. You risked everything for a stranger, for a principle, for what was right. That is the woman I fell in love with, Victoria. That brave, principled woman who pretended she was weak but was actually strong as steel." "I was weak," Victoria protested. "I spent my whole childhood and young adulthood unable to stand up for myself." "You were kind," Xavier corrected. "There is a difference. You had a generous spirit and the world took advantage of it, but you learned to protect that generosity, to direct it toward what mattered. That is not weakness. That is wisdom." Victoria settled into his arms, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. They were old now, their bodies marked by time and hard work. But when Xavier held her, she felt the same flutter of joy she had felt when they first kissed on the porch all those years ago. Time had deepened their love, adding layers of shared experience and mutual understanding, but it had not diminished it. If anything, she loved him more now than she had at 24, loved him with the full knowledge of who he was and who they had become together. They lived several more years in contentment, watching their grandchildren grow, seeing the ranch prosper under Samuel's capable management. Victoria continued to translate occasionally, working from home on documents that were mailed to her. Xavier remained involved in ranch decisions, though he left the physical work to younger men. They were aging gracefully together, supporting each other through the small indignities and larger challenges of growing old. In the fall of 1936, Xavier fell ill with pneumonia. Victoria nursed him through it, sitting by his bedside day and night, reading to him from his favorite books. He recovered, but he was frailer afterward, his energy diminished. The family worried, but Xavier waved off their concerns. "I am 74 years old," he said. "I have lived a full and happy life. Whatever time I have left is a gift." Victoria knew what he was not saying, that his time was growing short. She tried not to think about it, tried to focus on the present, on the blessing of each day they still had together. They spent their mornings on the porch, wrapped in blankets against the autumn chill, watching the sun rise over the mountains. They talked about everything and nothing, revisiting favorite memories, making plans they both knew might not come to fruition. One morning in late October, Xavier said, "I want you to promise me something." "Anything," Victoria said. "When I am gone, I want you to keep living. Keep working, keep using those 7 languages, keep being the remarkable woman you are. Do not lock yourself away in grief. Promise me." Victoria's eyes filled with tears. "I do not want to think about you being gone." "I know, but humor an old man. Promise me." "I promise," Victoria whispered. "I will keep living. For you and for me and for the family we built together." Xavier smiled and took her hand, and they sat in comfortable silence as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Xavier passed away peacefully in his sleep on a cold November night in 1936, 54 years to the day after they had married. Victoria woke to find him still and cold beside her, and she lay there for a long time, holding his hand, saying goodbye to the love of her life. When she finally rose and called for Samuel, her heart was shattered, but she also felt a strange sense of peace. Xavier had lived a full life, had died surrounded by the family he loved, had slipped away without pain or fear. There were worse ways to leave the world. The funeral was held at the church in Shoshone City, and it seemed like half the state attended. Xavier had been respected and loved, a man of integrity who had fought for what was right and built something lasting. Victoria sat in the front pew, flanked by her children and grandchildren, and listened to the eulogies with dry eyes. She had cried herself out in the days before the funeral. Now she simply felt numb, hollowed out by grief. But true to her promise, Victoria did not withdraw into mourning. She continued her translation work, finding solace in the familiar challenge of moving between languages. She spent time with her grandchildren, telling them stories about their grandfather, keeping his memory alive. She walked to the creek bridge often, standing where they had first confessed their love, feeling Xavier's presence in the wind and water. Samuel tried to convince her to move in with him and his family, but Victoria refused. "This house is where I built my life with your father," she said. "I am not ready to leave it. When I am too old to manage on my own, I will reconsider. But not yet." The years after Xavier's death were difficult, but also strangely peaceful. Victoria had time to reflect on her life, on the journey from that frightened young woman stepping off the stagecoach to the elderly matriarch she had become. She had learned so much about courage and choice and love. She had raised 4 children and seen them build good lives. She had built a career and made a difference in her community. She had loved deeply and been deeply loved in return. In 1940, on what would have been their 48th wedding anniversary, Victoria walked to the creek bridge one last time. She was 82 now, and the walk was harder than it used to be, but she persisted. She stood on the bridge, looking down at the water, remembering the young man who had sat on a flat rock and told her she was braver than she thought. Remembering the moment when she had decided to risk everything for what was right. Remembering 54 years of marriage, of partnership, of love. "I kept my promise," she said aloud to Xavier's memory. "I kept living. I kept working. I kept being who you helped me become. I hope you are proud of me wherever you are." The wind picked up, rustling through the bare cottonwoods, and Victoria smiled. She chose to believe it was Xavier's answer, his way of saying yes. "I am proud. I have always been proud. I love you still." Victoria lived 3 more years, dying peacefully in her sleep at age 85, in the house she and Xavier had shared for over 50 years. Her children found her in the morning, a letter on the bedside table addressed to all of them. In it, she had written about her life, about meeting Xavier, about learning to say yes to the right things and no to the wrong ones. She wrote about love and courage and choice. And she ended with these words: I came to Idaho in 1882 as a young woman who could not say no, who felt powerless and afraid. I met a man who saw past my weakness to my strength, who taught me that I was worth choosing, that my desires and convictions mattered. Together we built a life, a family, a legacy. I have no regrets. I lived fully, loved deeply, and tried always to do what was right. That is all anyone can ask. Remember me with joy, not sorrow. And remember that the choices you make, large and small, define who you are and what your life becomes. Choose wisely. Choose bravely. Choose love. Your mother, Victoria Dalton. The family gathered for her funeral, 4 children and 12 grandchildren and a handful of great-grandchildren. They buried her next to Xavier on a hill overlooking the ranch, beneath a headstone that read simply, Victoria Brennan Dalton, 1858–1943. She spoke 7 languages but learned to say no. Beloved wife, mother, grandmother, she chose love. The ranch continued under Samuel's management, and then his sons, passing down through generations. The house remained in the family, and Xavier and Victoria's great-great-grandchildren sometimes walked to the creek bridge and stood where their ancestors had first confessed their love. The story of how they met, how Victoria had warned Xavier about the mining consortium, how they had fought injustice together and fallen in love, became family legend, told and retold with growing embellishment. But the core of the story remained true. A young woman who learned to be brave, a man who saw her clearly, and a love that transformed them both and echoed down through the generations. In Shoshone City, elderly residents still remembered Victoria Dalton, the translator, who had stood up to powerful interests on behalf of exploited workers. In the state archives, her testimony about the mining consortium's labor practices was preserved as an important historical document. And on that bridge over Shoshone Creek, where the water still flowed clear thanks to the legal battle Victoria and Xavier had won, their names were carved into the wood by some anonymous descendant. Victoria and Xavier, 1882, 1936. They chose each other. The carving weathered over time but never quite disappeared, a testament to a love that had begun with a warning letter and a confession of weakness, and had grown into something strong enough to last lifetimes. Their story became part of the landscape, woven into the history of Idaho, a reminder that one person's courage could change everything, that learning to say yes to the right things was as important as learning to say no to the wrong ones, and that love, real love, was about seeing someone clearly and choosing them anyway, over and over, for as long as you both drew breath. Victoria Brennan had come to Shoshone City unable to refuse anyone anything. She left it having built a life of purpose and passion, having raised a family that would carry her values forward, having loved and been loved with a depth and constancy that most people only dream of. She had learned to say no when it mattered, but more importantly, she had learned when to say yes. And that yes, spoken to Xavier Dalton on a bridge over a creek in the wild Idaho mountains, had made all the difference.